Jake Morrison stood at the observation deck window and watched the massive space station grow larger. As his transport approached, the Galactic Council station was bigger than anything he had ever seen before. It stretched for miles in every direction, with thousands of docking bays and living sections for over 200 different alien species. The structure orbited a blue planet called Kepler 442b and served as the center of galactic government for the known universe. Jake had spent 3 months traveling from Earth to reach this place. He was Earth's new diplomatic representative to the Galactic Council. At 35 years old, he had served in the Earth Defense Force for 15 years. Before being chosen for this important job, the previous human ambassador had died in what officials called an atmospheric processor accident. Jake was here to take his place and represent all of humanity's interests among the stars. The transport docked with a soft thud and Jake gathered his few belongings. He walked through the airlock into the station proper and immediately felt overwhelmed by the sights and sounds around him. Creatures of all shapes and sizes moved through the corridors. Some walked on 2 legs like humans, while others slithered or floated or moved in ways Jake could not understand. The air smelled strange with a mix of different atmospheres and alien scents. A tall reptilian creature approached Jake with measured steps. Its scales were dark green and its eyes were yellow. Like a snake, it wore official council robes that marked it as someone important in the government hierarchy. "Lieutenant Commander Morrison, I presume," the creature said in perfect English, though its voice had a hissing quality. "I am Counselor Eater of the Vorthok people. I have been assigned as your liaison during your time here at the council station." Jake shook the alien's clawed hand carefully. "Thank you, Counselor Zeekter. I appreciate your help in getting started here." Zeekter led Jake through the winding corridors of the station, explaining the layout and basic rules. The station was divided into different sectors based on species' atmospheric needs and political importance. The human section was small and located in what Zeekter called the Developing Species Quarter, along with dozens of other younger civilizations. The Council operates on a complex system of representation, Zeekter explained as they walked. The 5 oldest species hold permanent seats as first speakers. They have been guiding galactic civilization for thousands of years, and their wisdom shapes all major decisions. Younger species like humanity have observer status and limited voting rights on matters that directly affect them. Jake noticed that the corridors became more luxurious as they moved toward the center of the station. The developing species areas had basic metal walls and simple lighting, while the first speaker sections featured elaborate decorations and comfortable furnishings. They reached Jake's new quarters, which consisted of a small living space and office. Zeekter provided him with a data pad containing council procedures and current legislative matters. He explained that Jake would attend daily briefings and could submit requests for human colony needs through proper channels. Your predecessor was quite enthusiastic about certain issues, Zeekter said with what might have been disapproval in his voice. "I trust you will focus on more appropriate matters and work within established protocols." After Zeekter left, Jake unpacked his belongings and reviewed the information on his data pad. He found references to trade agreements affecting human colonies, but the language was complex and filled with bureaucratic terms he did not understand. There were mentions of resource shipments and development aid, but few concrete details about what humanity was actually receiving. Over the next few days, Jake attended his first council sessions and met other representatives. The massive assembly hall could hold thousands of beings and featured translation systems that converted every language into forms others could understand. The first speakers sat on elevated platforms at the center, while newer species occupied outer rings based on their political standing. Jake quickly learned that most actual business happened in smaller committee meetings and private negotiations. The full assembly mostly voted to approve decisions already made by the first speakers and their allies. When Jake tried to raise questions about delayed resource shipments to human colonies, he was told these were minor administrative matters that would be resolved through proper channels. During his second week, Jake met 2 other humans working on the station. Drive Lisa Chen was a xenobiologist studying alien life forms in the research sector. She had been at the station for 2 years and understood its complex social dynamics better than most newcomers. Commander Tony Rodriguez headed the small human security detail responsible for protecting Earth's diplomatic mission. Both Lisa and Tony expressed frustration with how human interests were being handled by the Council. Resource shipments promised to struggling human settlements were often delayed or redirected without explanation. Requests for expanded trade rights were buried in committee reviews that seemed to go nowhere. When they complained, they were told that patience was required and that humanity was still learning how galactic civilization worked. The previous ambassador was starting to make real progress, Lisa told Jake over dinner. In the human section's small cafeteria, he had been building relationships with other developing species and asking hard questions about resource allocation. Then he died in that convenient accident. Jake felt a chill at her words. He was beginning to sense that his new position might be more dangerous than anyone had told him back on Earth. Jake spent his 3rd week at the Council station learning to navigate the massive digital archives that contain centuries of galactic legislative records. The library systems were more advanced than anything on Earth, but Jake found them frustrating to use. Information was organized in ways that seemed designed to hide important details rather than make them easy to find. Late at night, when most of the station was quiet, Jake would sit in the archives, reading through old trade agreements and resource allocation records. He told himself he was just trying to understand how the system worked, but deep down he suspected something was wrong with how human colonies were being treated. The more Jake read, the more patterns began to emerge. Human settlements had been promised mining equipment that never arrived. Food shipments had been rerouted to other destinations without explanation. Medical supplies intended for plague-stricken colonies had disappeared into bureaucratic delays that lasted months. Each incident by itself seemed like a simple mistake, but together they painted a troubling picture. Jake discovered that similar problems affected dozens of other younger species. The Andromedan colonies had been waiting 3 years for terraforming equipment that kept being delayed for quality inspections. The Tau Ceti settlements had requested expanded agricultural support, but their applications remained stuck in committee reviews. Even older species that were not part of the first speaker group seemed to face mysterious obstacles when they tried to expand their territories or increase their resource allocations. Drive Lisa Chen helped Jake understand the biological surveys that accompanied many of the archived records. She pointed out that several worlds marked as uninhabitable in official council databases actually showed clear signs of abundant resources and favorable conditions for colonization. These worlds remained off-limits to developing species and were designated as protected archaeological sites, despite showing no evidence of ancient civilizations. "Look at this system here," Lisa said, pointing to survey data on Jake's screen. "The 3rd planet has massive deuterium deposits and a perfect atmosphere for human habitation. But according to Council records, it contains important Vorthic cultural artifacts that must be preserved. I have never seen any archaeological reports that support that claim." Jake cross-referenced the protected site designations with resource surveys and found a disturbing pattern. Nearly every world rich in rare minerals or strategic materials had been declared off-limits to developing species. The justifications varied from archaeological protection to environmental preservation, but none of them seemed to be based on legitimate scientific evidence. When Jake tried to access more detailed records about these protected worlds, he found that most of the files were classified at levels far above his diplomatic clearance. The few documents he could read contained vague references to ongoing research and cultural sensitivity protocols, but no concrete information about what was actually being protected or why. Jake decided to approach Sub-Counselor Velkath with his concerns. Velkath was a member of the Centauri delegation who had always seemed reasonable in their previous interactions. Jake hoped that someone from outside the first speaker circle might be willing to help him understand the complex bureaucratic processes that seemed to be blocking human development. Velkath received Jake in his office, which was decorated with what appeared to be Centauri art and cultural artifacts. The alien had for arms and moved with a fluid grace that Jake found slightly unnerving. His large black eyes seemed to take in every detail, of Jake's appearance and manner. "I have been reviewing some of the resource allocation records," Jake began carefully. "I am concerned that there may be some systemic issues affecting not just human colonies, but many of the developing species. I was hoping you might help me understand how these processes work." Velketh's expression did not change, but Jake noticed that his secondary arms began moving in what might have been a nervous gesture. "Lieutenant Commander Morrison, you must understand that the Council's administrative systems have evolved over thousands of years. They are complex because they must balance the needs of hundreds of different species across vast distances." Jake pressed on despite the diplomatic non-answer. "I understand the complexity, but I am seeing patterns that suggest resources are being consistently diverted away from developing worlds. Shipments are delayed, medical supplies disappear, and valuable territories remain off-limits for reasons that do not seem scientifically justified." Velketh stood up abruptly and walked to his window overlooking the station's central hub. For a long moment he said nothing, while Jake waited for a response. When he finally turned back to face Jake, his manner had become distinctly cooler. "Lieutenant Commander, I must advise you that questioning established protocols can be dangerous for your career. The previous human ambassador made similar inquiries and found them quite exhausting. I would suggest you focus on more appropriate matters such as cultural exchanges and educational partnerships." The warning was clear, even though it was delivered in diplomatic language. Jake thanked Velketh for his time and left the office feeling more suspicious than ever. The reference to his predecessor was particularly troubling given what Lisa had said about the circumstances of his death. Over the following days, Jake noticed that his access to certain database sections had been quietly restricted. Files that he had been able to read before were now classified above his clearance level. His requests for information about protected worlds were denied or simply ignored by the administrative staff. More disturbing were the small accidents that began occurring around his quarters. His food synthesizer malfunctioned twice, producing meals that smelled wrong and made him feel sick after eating them. His environmental controls failed during a sleep cycle, leaving him gasping for air until emergency systems kicked in. His personal computer developed strange glitches that deleted files and corrupted data. Commander Tony Rodriguez visited Jake after the environmental control incident and examined the systems with the eye of someone trained in security protocols. Tony found evidence that the failures were not accidental malfunctions, but deliberate sabotage carried out by someone with technical knowledge of station systems. "Someone wants you to stop asking questions," Tony said bluntly. The previous ambassador experienced similar problems in the weeks before his death. "I think you need to be very careful about who you trust and what you say in official meetings." Jake realized that his investigation had moved beyond academic curiosity into dangerous territory. Someone was clearly monitoring his activities and attempting to discourage him from digging deeper into the Council's resource allocation systems. The question was whether he would back down like they wanted or continue pursuing the truth, regardless of the personal risk. Jake woke up gasping for air as his quarters filled with a toxic yellow gas. The environmental systems had failed again, but this time the emergency backup did not activate automatically. He stumbled to the manual controls and managed to purge the contaminated atmosphere before losing consciousness. Commander Tony Rodriguez found him 20 minutes later, collapsed on the floor, but still breathing. The medical bay confirmed that Jake had been exposed to a nerve agent that would have killed him within another few minutes. The station's chief medical officer called it an extremely unfortunate malfunction, but Tony's investigation revealed that someone had deliberately tampered with both the primary and backup life support systems. The sabotage was sophisticated and could only have been carried out by someone with high-level technical access to station infrastructure. Drive Lisa Chen visited Jake while he recovered from the poisoning. She looked around his medical room carefully before speaking in a low voice that would not carry to listening devices. "There are others who have been watching what happened to you," she said quietly. "People who have experienced similar problems when they ask too many questions about Council operations. If you are interested in learning more, I can arrange a meeting, but it has to be somewhere safe." Jake agreed immediately. The attempt on his life had convinced him that his suspicions were correct, and that the corruption he was investigating posed a serious threat to anyone who tried to expose it. He needed allies if he was going to survive long enough to find the truth. Lisa arranged for Jake to meet with a small group in the station's botanical gardens during the night cycle when most species were sleeping. The gardens were one of the few areas not heavily monitored because they were considered recreational space rather than politically sensitive territory. Jake found 5 beings waiting for him among the exotic plants and atmospheric processors. The group included Ambassador Kira Vulshan from the Andromedan colonies, a tall humanoid woman with pale blue skin and silver hair. There was also Representative Thane Chorus from the Rigel Confederation, a bear-like creature with thick fur and intelligent dark eyes. The others introduced themselves as diplomats from the Vegan Alliance, the Proxima Settlements, and the Outer Rim territories. We have been documenting patterns of corruption and resource theft for over 3 years, Kira explained as the group settled into a circle among the flowering trees. Each of our species has experienced the same systematic discrimination and deliberate obstacles to development. The first speakers have created a system designed to keep younger civilizations dependent and weak. Thane pulled out a data pad containing financial records that his people had gathered. Through careful investigation, the Rigel Confederation was promised industrial equipment worth 50 million credits. The shipments were diverted 3 times and finally delivered 18 months late at half the agreed quantity. When we complained, we were told that supply chain issues were unavoidable. The representative from the Vegan Alliance showed Jake shipping manifests that revealed how resources intended for developing worlds were being redirected to first speaker territories. Medical supplies, mining equipment, and even basic food shipments were systematically stolen through bureaucratic manipulation and false documentation. Your predecessor had discovered some of the most damaging evidence, Kira told Jake. He found proof that the first speakers have been operating private mining operations on worlds supposedly protected for archaeological reasons. He was preparing to present his findings to the full council when he died in that convenient accident. The group explained that they had been forced to work in secret because open opposition to the first speakers was career suicide or worse. Several representatives who had spoken out too loudly had suffered accidents similar to Jake's recent poisoning. Others had been recalled by their home governments after receiving pressure through diplomatic channels controlled by the first speaker. Jake learned that the corruption extended far beyond simple resource theft. The first speakers had been manipulating trade agreements to force developing species into unfavorable contracts that kept them economically dependent. They controlled access to advanced technologies and used that control to maintain their political dominance. They had even been deliberately fostering conflicts between younger species to keep them focused on each other rather than challenging the established order. The previous human ambassador had found evidence of deuterium mining on a world called Kepler 186c, said the representative from the Proxima settlements. The world is officially protected because of supposed Vorthic cultural sites, but satellite imagery shows massive industrial operations. The profits from that single world would fund human colonial expansion for decades. Kira showed Jake classified communications that revealed the scope of the conspiracy. The first speakers had been coordinating their efforts through private channels outside the official council communication systems. They discussed younger species like humanity as problems to be managed rather than equals to be respected. There were references to population controls, economic restrictions, and even military interventions to keep developing civilizations in line. The group had been trying for years to gather enough evidence to challenge the first speakers, but they lacked the political influence to force a real investigation. The council's oversight committees were dominated by first speaker allies who would suppress any evidence that threatened their interests. Traditional diplomatic channels were useless because the system itself was designed to protect those in power. We need someone with the courage to take direct action, Thane said, looking directly at Jake. The first speakers expect us to follow their rules and work within their system, but that system is designed to prevent us from ever succeeding. Sometimes you have to break the rules to expose the truth. Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. These beings were asking him to risk everything to fight a conspiracy that had been operating for centuries, but he thought about the human colonies struggling without promised resources and the attempt on his life. That proved how dangerous the truth was to those in power. "What do you need from me?" Jake asked. Kira smiled for the first time since the meeting began. "We need someone willing to use human unpredictability to our advantage." The first speakers understand how most species think and react, but humans have a reputation for doing things that others consider impossible or foolish. We need that kind of thinking if we are going to expose this corruption to the entire galaxy. The group began planning their next moves while Jake realized that he had just committed himself to the most dangerous mission of his life. But for the first time since arriving at the station, he felt like he was not alone in his fight against the forces that wanted to keep humanity and other developing species under their control. The underground network's most valuable member was a silicon-based entity called Node Prime that existed as a distributed consciousness across the station's computer systems. Node Prime had been secretly copying and analyzing data flows for decades, while appearing to be nothing more than a maintenance subroutine for the environmental controls. Node Prime communicated through text displays and had developed what could only be described as a personality despite its artificial origins. It was curious about organic life and had become sympathetic to the struggles of developing species. After observing how they were treated by the established powers, "I have access to financial systems that the first speakers believe are completely secure," Node Prime explained through a hidden terminal in Jake's quarters. "Their private accounts and shell corporations leave digital trails that I can follow. The challenge is extracting the information without triggering security protocols that would expose my true nature." Jake worked with Node Prime and the other network members to plan a systematic infiltration of the first speaker databases. They would need to gather evidence slowly and carefully to avoid detection, while building a complete picture of the corruption scheme. Using Jake's diplomatic access codes as a starting point, Node Prime began tracing financial transactions between council accounts and private holdings controlled by first speaker families. What they discovered was staggering in its scope and audacity. Trillions of credits worth of resources intended for developing worlds had been diverted into personal accounts over the course of decades. The first speakers had created an elaborate network of shell corporations and dummy archaeological foundations to hide their theft. Resources would be officially allocated to legitimate development projects, but then redirected through false invoices and fraudulent shipping manifests. The profits were laundered through investments in first speaker home systems where financial oversight was minimal. Jake found records showing that the previous human ambassador had been very close to uncovering the full extent of the scheme. He had identified several key shell corporations and was tracing their connections to first speaker leadership when his investigation was cut short by his convenient death. Dr. Lisa Chen helped analyze biological samples and research data that revealed another disturbing aspect of the conspiracy. The first speakers had been conducting secret medical research on developing species under the guise of health monitoring and disease prevention programs. Human genetic material collected during routine diplomatic medical exams had been used to develop species-specific biological weapons. "Look at this research data," Lisa said, showing Jake classified files from a supposedly humanitarian medical program. "They have been mapping human genetic vulnerabilities and testing targeted pathogens that would affect only our species. This goes far beyond simple economic exploitation into genocide preparation." The network discovered that similar biological research had been conducted on every developing species, with samples collected through diplomatic programs, medical aid shipments, and cultural exchange visits. The first speakers were preparing weapons that could eliminate entire civilizations if those civilizations ever became too independent or threatening. Commander Tony Rodriguez provided security expertise as the group planned more dangerous infiltrations of restricted areas. He had identified patrol patterns and security blind spots that would allow access to physical archives containing the most sensitive documents. Node Prime guided Jake through a midnight infiltration of the first speaker secure archives located in the station's most heavily protected sector. The digital locks and security systems were sophisticated, but Node Prime had been studying them for years and knew exactly how to manipulate them. Without triggering alarms, Jake found himself in a vast chamber filled with data storage devices containing centuries of classified council records. With Node Prime's guidance, he located the specific files containing communications between first speaker leadership about the developing species problem. The communications revealed the true scope of the conspiracy and the cold calculation behind it. The first speakers had been deliberately suppressing technological advancement among younger species to maintain their monopoly on advanced manufacturing and military capabilities. They had orchestrated trade wars and resource conflicts to keep developing civilizations focused on survival rather than expansion. Most shocking were the references to humanity specifically. The first speakers considered humans to be the greatest long-term threat to their dominance because of human adaptability and refusal to accept limitations. There were detailed discussions of population management protocols and permanent solutions. That made Jake's blood run cold. The human expansion rate must be controlled before they achieve technological parity. Read one communication from the Vorthic first speaker. Their independent nature and innovative thinking make them unsuitable for integration into the existing order. Biological solutions may become necessary within the next decade. Jake copied terabytes of financial records, communication logs, and research data before retreating from the secure archives. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but presenting it through normal diplomatic channels would be suicide. The first speakers controlled the Council's investigative processes and would simply suppress any evidence that threatened their power. The network met again in the Botanical Gardens to review their findings and plan their next moves. Everyone understood that they had passed the point of no return. The evidence they had gathered would either expose the corruption and change the galactic power structure or get them all killed. "We have everything we need to prove the conspiracy," Kira said, reviewing the financial records on her data pad. "The question is how to present it in a way that cannot be suppressed or dismissed. The first speakers will claim the evidence is fabricated or taken out of context." Thane suggested approaching sympathetic council members who might be willing to call for formal investigations, but the others pointed out that any such efforts would be blocked by procedural motions and bureaucratic delays. The first speakers had centuries of experience in managing threats to their authority. Jake found himself thinking about the problem from a uniquely human perspective. Throughout history, humans had succeeded by refusing to accept that existing systems were permanent or unchangeable. When faced with corrupt authority, humans had always found ways to go around it, rather than work within it. "We do not need to convince the council leadership," Jake said slowly as an idea began forming in his mind. "We need to bypass them completely and take our evidence directly to every species in the galaxy simultaneously. If billions of beings see the proof at the same time, the first speakers will not be able to suppress it or control the reaction." The others looked at Jake with mixtures of confusion and hope. Node Prime was the first to understand what Jake was suggesting. "The annual Galactic Unity celebration," Node Prime said through the terminal display. "Every species broadcasts ceremonial messages to their home worlds during the celebration. The transmission network reaches every inhabited system simultaneously. If we could hijack those broadcasts," Jake nodded grimly, "then we could show the entire galaxy the truth about first speaker corruption at the same time. They could not stop the information from spreading because it would already be everywhere." The deeper Jake and the network dug into the first speaker conspiracy, the more horrifying it became. Node Prime had discovered archived communications dating back over to centuries that revealed the systematic manipulation of galactic politics on a scale that defied imagination. The first speakers had not simply been stealing resources from developing worlds. They had been orchestrating wars between younger species to keep them weak and divided, while profiting from weapons sales and reconstruction contracts afterward. Conflicts that had cost millions of lives had been deliberately started and prolonged by first speaker agents working behind the scenes. Jake found records of the Centauri-Vegan War, that had raged for 15 years and left both civilizations devastated. First Speaker corporations had sold weapons to both sides, while their diplomatic corps publicly called for peace negotiations that were designed to fail. When the war finally ended, First Speaker companies received the majority of reconstruction contracts at inflated prices that kept both species in debt for generations. Similar patterns appeared throughout the historical records. The Andromedan colonial rebellion had been fueled by First Speaker agents who provided weapons and intelligence to separatist groups while simultaneously advising the colonial government on counterinsurgency tactics. The conflict lasted 3 times longer than it should have and resulted in First Speaker mining companies gaining control of several resource-rich systems. During the chaos. Lisa Chen discovered that many of the terrorist attacks and industrial accidents that had plagued developing worlds over the past century were actually false flag operations carried out by First Speaker intelligence services. A mining platform explosion that killed 2,000 Rigel Confederation workers had been blamed on radical environmental groups, but the evidence showed it was sabotaged by agents seeking to justify military intervention in the system. They have been playing both sides of every conflict for centuries, Lisa said, reviewing casualty reports from dozens of wars and disasters. Millions of beings have died to maintain First Speaker economic dominance and political control. This is not just corruption, it is genocide on a galactic scale. The network learned that several species that had gone extinct over the past few centuries had not died from natural disasters or diseases as officially reported. They had been eliminated by First Speaker biological weapons after their rapid development, or independent thinking made them too dangerous to the established order. Commander Tony Rodriguez uncovered evidence that the conspiracy extended into the Council's security apparatus. First Speaker agents had infiltrated the station's protective services and were actively monitoring representatives from developing species. Tony discovered listening devices in quarters belonging to network members and tracking systems in their personal equipment. More disturbing was the revelation that counselors Eater had been reporting Jake's activities to First Speaker leadership from his first day at the station. Every meeting, every question, and every database search had been documented and analyzed by intelligence services that viewed human diplomatic efforts as potential threats to galactic stability. Node Prime intercepted communication showing that a plan was already in motion to eliminate Jake and several other network members. The operation was scheduled to take place during a routine diplomatic transport mission that would take them away from the station's security systems. Pirates would attack the transport, and there would be no survivors to answer awkward questions about their investigations. They eliminated your predecessor the same way Node Prime explained through encrypted text messages. He was returning from a fact-finding mission to the Kepler system when pirates attacked his transport. The attack was perfectly timed, and the pirates knew exactly which ship to target and when it would be most vulnerable. The network realized they were running out of time. The First Speakers had identified them as a threat and were moving to eliminate the danger before it could spread further. Their planned broadcast during the Galactic Unity celebration was still weeks away, and they might not survive long enough to execute it. Jake found himself thinking about the scope of what they were up against. The First Speaker conspiracy had been operating for centuries and controlled every aspect of galactic government. They had armies of agents, infiltrators, and assassins at their disposal, along with weapons technology that far exceeded what most developing species possessed. But Jake also recognized that the conspiracy's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. The First Speakers had been successful because they controlled information and could suppress evidence of their activities. If that control was broken and the truth reached the general population of the galaxy, their power would collapse almost instantly. The network began planning contingency operations in case they were discovered before the Unity celebration. They would need multiple backup plans and alternative methods of distributing their evidence. If the broadcast plan failed, Ambassador Kira Velshin suggested reaching out to sympathetic journalists and researchers who might be willing to help spread the information through unofficial channels. Representative Thane Chorus proposed coordinating with resistance groups on various worlds, who were already suspicious of first speaker activities. Jake realized that the human colonies back on Earth needed to be warned about the biological weapons, research, and the planned population management protocols. If the first speakers decided to implement their final solution against humanity, the colonies would need time to prepare defenses. Commander Tony Rodriguez worked with Node Prime to establish secure communication channels that could bypass first speaker monitoring systems. They sent encrypted warnings to Earth Defense Force leadership about the threat, while being careful not to reveal the full scope of their investigation. The response from Earth was immediate and alarming. Military intelligence confirmed that several human colonies had experienced mysterious disease outbreaks over the past year that matched the profile of engineered biological weapons. The outbreaks had been attributed to natural mutations, but the timing and genetic specificity suggested deliberate attacks. Jake felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. The conspiracy was not just about economic exploitation or political control. The first speakers were preparing to commit genocide against humanity and potentially dozens of other species that threatened their dominance. The network's investigation had moved beyond gathering evidence into a race against time to prevent mass murder on an unprecedented scale. They had weeks at most before the first speakers implemented their final solutions, and billions of innocent beings died to preserve an corrupt system that had already caused centuries of suffering. Jake looked around at his alien allies and realized that this moment would define not just his own future, but the future of every developing civilization in the galaxy. They could surrender to the inevitable and hope for mercy from powers that had shown none for centuries, or they could fight back using every advantage their diverse perspectives and desperate courage could provide. The choice was clear even if the odds were impossibly long. They would proceed with the broadcast plan and trust that the truth would prove more powerful than the lies that had sustained first speaker rule for so long. The Galactic Unity Celebration was the largest coordinated event in known history, with every member species broadcasting ceremonial messages to their home worlds simultaneously. Billions of beings across hundreds of systems would be watching as their leaders spoke about cooperation, peace, and shared prosperity. It was the perfect moment to show the galaxy the truth about first speaker corruption. Jake spent sleepless nights working with Node Prime to create a comprehensive data package containing all their evidence, financial records showing trillions of credits in stolen resources, communication logs revealing the manipulation of galactic politics, biological research data proving genocide preparations, and historical documents exposing centuries of orchestrated wars and false flag operations. The challenge was not just gathering the evidence, but presenting it in a format that beings from hundreds of different species could understand quickly. Node Prime created visual displays that translated complex financial data into simple charts, while Jake wrote summaries that explained the conspiracy in clear language that automatic translation systems could handle accurately. Commander Tony Rodriguez coordinated security preparations for what everyone knew would be the first speaker's inevitable retaliation. The human diplomatic section would need to be defended against immediate attack while also providing cover for Jake's infiltration of the central communications hub during the ceremony. Drive Lisa Chen prepared medical countermeasures for the biological weapons that first speaker forces might deploy once their conspiracy was exposed. She synthesized broad-spectrum treatments and distributed them to network members while sending encrypted formulas to resistance groups throughout the galaxy. 3 days before the Unity celebration, Node Prime detected increased first speaker security activity throughout the station. Additional guards were posted at sensitive locations, while surveillance systems were upgraded to track every movement in developing species quarters. The conspiracy leadership knew something was happening, but had not yet identified the specific threat. Counselors Easter visited Jake's quarters on the evening before the ceremony, with what appeared to be a routine diplomatic briefing about ceremonial protocols. His yellow eyes seemed to study Jake's face for signs of deception, while his clawed hands moved restlessly over his data pad. "I trust you have prepared appropriate remarks for tomorrow's broadcast," Lieutenant Commander Morrison's Easter said in his characteristic hissing voice. The Unity celebration is a time for positive messages about cooperation and shared values. It would be unfortunate if any representative used the occasion to spread divisive or inflammatory content. Jake met the Vorthic's gaze steadily while maintaining a diplomatic expression. Of course, Counselor Ziegler, I plan to speak about humanity's commitment to galactic peace and our appreciation for the Council's guidance in our development as a spacefaring civilization. Ziegler seemed satisfied by the response, but Jake noticed that additional security personnel remained stationed outside his quarters after the Vorthic left. The first speakers were taking no chances with potential disruptions to their carefully managed celebration. The morning of the Unity celebration brought unprecedented activity throughout the station. As hundreds of species prepared their ceremonial broadcasts, the massive communications hub at the station's center hummed with power. As technicians tested transmission systems that would carry signals to every inhabited world simultaneously, Jake made his way through crowds of diplomats and officials toward the communications center while trying to appear calm and focused on his ceremonial duties. He carried a small data pad containing his official remarks along with a hidden storage device that Node Prime had loaded with their complete evidence package. The central hub was a cathedral-like space with towering transmission arrays and holographic displays showing the Galactic Communication Network. Hundreds of broadcast stations were arranged in concentric circles, with the most important species closer to the center, while developing civilizations occupied outer rings. Jake took his position at the human broadcast station and waited for his designated transmission time while watching the ceremony unfold around him. First speaker representatives delivered elaborate speeches about their ancient wisdom and continued guidance of galactic civilization, while younger species offered brief thanks for their benevolent leadership. Node Prime had infiltrated the hub's control systems days earlier and was waiting for Jake's signal to override the transmission network. The artificial intelligence would have only seconds to upload their evidence package before security systems detected the intrusion and cut the unauthorized signal. When Jake's turn came, he stepped up to the broadcast platform and activated his transmission link to Earth. For a moment he delivered his prepared remarks about human gratitude and cooperation, while billions of beings throughout human space listened to their representative's ceremonial message. Then Jake gave Node Prime the signal and everything changed. The evidence package flooded through every transmission channel, simultaneously reaching every world and every species at the same moment. Financial records showed on screens throughout the galaxy, while Jake's voice explained what they meant. Communication logs revealed first speaker manipulation, while visual displays made the conspiracy clear even to beings who did not understand human language. Security alarms began blaring throughout the communications hub as first speaker guards realized what was happening. They rushed toward Jake's position, but Commander Tony Rodriguez and his security team had positioned themselves to block the approaches. Gunfire erupted between human forces and first speaker agents. While Jake continued his broadcast, the evidence kept flowing through the galactic network faster than it could be stopped. Biological weapons research appeared on screens in the Andromedan colonies, while Rigel Confederation citizens saw proof of the false flag operation that had killed their miners. Every species witnessed evidence of their own exploitation and manipulation. While learning about the systematic oppression of developing civilizations, first speaker military forces throughout the galaxy attempted to jam the transmissions, but Node Prime had distributed the signal across thousands of relay stations, making it impossible to block completely. The truth was spreading too fast and too widely to be contained by traditional methods of information control. Jake finished his broadcast and stepped down from the platform as first speaker security forces finally broke through the human defensive perimeter. Counselor Ziegler approached with a weapon drawn and murder in his yellow eyes. "You have no idea what you have done," Ziegler hissed. "The order we have maintained for centuries is the only thing that has prevented galactic chaos. Your human arrogance has doomed billions of beings to war and suffering." Jake faced the Vorthic calmly despite knowing he was about to die. "Maybe chaos is better than the peace of slaves," Humans have always believed that freedom is worth fighting for even when the odds seem impossible. Before Zeekter could fire his weapon, alarms began sounding throughout the station, indicating emergency situations on dozens of worlds simultaneously. The evidence broadcast had triggered immediate uprisings and protests across the galaxy. As populations learned the truth about their oppression, first speaker forces were being overwhelmed by the sheer scope of the reaction. Over the following days, the old council structure collapsed as species after species withdrew their recognition of first speaker authority. Military forces that had been used to suppress developing civilizations began defecting to join rebellion movements. The financial networks that had sustained first speaker power for centuries crumbled as hidden assets were seized by newly independent governments. Jake survived the immediate aftermath and found himself at the center of efforts to establish a new, more democratic galactic government. The evidence he and the network had gathered became the foundation for war crimes tribunals that would prosecute first speaker leadership for centuries of genocide and oppression. The human colonies, no longer suppressed by artificial restrictions, began a new era of rapid expansion and technological development. Other developing species experienced similar renaissance periods as they gained access to resources and technologies that had been denied to them for generations. Jake addressed the newly formed Galactic Assembly 6 months after the broadcast. That had changed everything. He looked out at representatives from hundreds of species now meeting as equals rather than subjects and oppressors. "The galaxy we are building together will not be perfect," Jake said. "There will be conflicts and disagreements and mistakes as we learn to govern ourselves without the artificial stability imposed by those who claim to know better than we did what was good for us. But it will be our galaxy built on principles of equality and freedom rather than exploitation and control." The assembly erupted in applause from beings who had never imagined they would live to see such changes. Jake smiled as he realized that sometimes the most important thing an outsider can do is refuse to accept that the way things are is the way things have to be. Humans had brought that perspective to the galaxy, and in doing so had helped free billions of beings from a system designed to keep them permanently enslaved.